The Venezuela bombing triggered a chain reaction that will reshape global alignments for the next decade. The immediate aftermath, regional condemnation, humanitarian concerns, diplomatic tensions, captures attention, but misses the larger dynamics already in motion. What happens next matters far more than what happened yesterday. Latin America will accelerate integration with China and Russia. BRICS Plus will expand faster and coordinate more effectively. Middle powers globally will hedge harder against American dominance. The petrodollar system will erode more rapidly. And most significantly, countries that were merely considering alternatives to American-dominated systems will now actively build them. The bombing was intended to demonstrate American power and deter challenges to American interests. The chain reaction it triggered will demonstrate American limits and accelerate exactly the multipolar transformation the bombing was meant to prevent. Understanding the chain reaction requires examining the specific mechanisms through which the bombing changes calculations, creates opportunities, and shifts momentum across multiple dimensions of global competition. Latin America's response represents the first and most visible link in the chain. The regional reaction wasn't just rhetorical condemnation. It was the catalyzing moment for integration projects that have been developing slowly for years, but lacked the political momentum to overcome obstacles. The bombing provided that momentum by making explicit what was previously implicit. American military force backs American economic preferences in the hemisphere, and countries that want genuine sovereignty need alternatives. Mexico, under President Sheinbaum, will accelerate non-dollar trade relationships. Mexican oil exports already go partially to China. Mexican manufacturing increasingly integrates with Asian supply chains. But Mexican financial systems remain deeply connected to the United States through USMCA, dollar-denominated trade, and integrated banking. The bombing shifts the calculation on acceptable risk levels for reducing dollar exposure. Expect announcements within weeks of expanded yuan-peso swap lines, Chinese financing for Mexican infrastructure that reduces dependence on American capital markets, and Mexican participation in alternative payment systems. This matters enormously because Mexico is the United States' largest trading partner and most integrated economic relationship. If Mexico reduces dollar dependency even modestly, say from 85% of trade to 70%, the demonstration effect for other countries is substantial. It shows that even highly integrated economies can diversify away from dollar systems when political calculations change. And once the infrastructure for non-dollar trade exists, it doesn't disappear if political tensions ease. The diversification becomes permanent. Brazil under Lula will position itself as the leader of Latin American independence from American economic dominance. Lula has been cautious about overtly confronting the United States despite his leftist politics and rhetoric about multipolarity. The bombing removes the need for caution. Brazil can present itself as defending Latin American sovereignty against American aggression without seeming to pick unnecessary fights. This provides political cover for economic policies Lula wanted to pursue anyway. Expect Brazil to lead expansion of local currency trade agreements across Latin America. The existing bilateral arrangements between Brazil and Argentina, Brazil and China will extend to Chile, Peru, Colombia, and potentially Mexico. These won't eliminate dollar trade immediately, but they create the infrastructure and precedent for non-dollar commerce. Brazil will also push for South American Regional Development Bank capitalization that provides alternatives to IMF and World Bank financing for infrastructure projects. Most significantly, Brazil will accelerate yuan trade with China beyond current levels. China is already Brazil's largest trading partner, but much of the trade still settles in dollars. Shifting to yuan settlement reduces transaction costs, eliminates dollar exchange rate risk, and creates yuan liquidity pools in São Paulo that enable broader yuan commerce. This positions Brazil as the yuan hub for Latin America, the equivalent of what London was for dollar commerce in Europe. Chinese banks will establish major operations in São Paulo specifically to support this role. The infrastructure projects will be concrete and substantial. Brazil needs massive investment in transportation, energy, and agricultural logistics. The existing soy-to-China trade already makes China Brazil's essential partner, but infrastructure financing has come from mixed sources. Expect announcements of Chinese financing for port expansions in Santos and Paranaguá, specifically to handle increased soy exports. Railway development connecting agricultural regions to ports will shift from Western to Chinese financing. The Belo Monte and other hydroelectric projects will see increased Chinese investment specifically because dollar-based financing comes with political conditions that yuan financing doesn't impose. The Amazon development presents complicated politics but will see Chinese engagement increase. Brazilian environmental concerns conflict with agricultural expansion pressures. Chinese financing for sustainable development in the Amazon, however defined, allows Brazil to proceed with development that Western environmental conditionality would block. This creates Brazilian dependence on Chinese capital specifically for politically sensitive projects. Argentina under Milei presents a complication, but not an obstacle. Milei is ideologically pro-American and has supported the bombing rhetorically, but Argentina's economic desperation means it needs Chinese financing regardless of Milei's preferences. China has already extended billions to Argentina to prevent default. That leverage means China can demand yuan trade expansion as a condition for continued support. Milei may resist rhetorically while complying practically. And if Milei's government falls due to economic failure, any successor will be even more willing to align with China. The CELAC response will move from rhetorical condemnation to institutional development. CELAC, the community of Latin American and Caribbean states that excludes the United States and Canada, has been largely symbolic without substantial policy coordination. The bombing provides the justification for making CELAC operationally significant. Expect proposals for CELAC coordinated responses to American pressure, CELAC China infrastructure financing frameworks, and potentially CELAC security cooperation agreements. The most radical possibility is CELAC developing into a genuine alternative to the Organization of American States. The OAS has been American-dominated since its creation and is increasingly irrelevant as Latin American nations pursue independent policies. If CELAC becomes the primary forum for hemispheric diplomacy, American influence over regional political coordination collapses. This won't happen immediately, but the bombing accelerates movement in that direction. The Caribbean nations face different calculations but reach similar conclusions. Most are small, economically vulnerable, and traditionally aligned with the United States through proximity and aid dependence. But they're also heavily indebted, facing climate vulnerability that requires massive infrastructure investment, and watching China provide exactly the financing they need without the political conditions that come with Western aid. The bombing demonstrates that American alignment doesn't guarantee American support. It guarantees American demands backed by threats. Caribbean nations will accelerate Chinese infrastructure financing specifically for climate adaptation and debt restructuring. This creates dependencies on Chinese rather than American capital that shift political alignments over time. The Belt and Road Initiative will expand in the Caribbean specifically because the bombing demonstrated that American power in the region is about dominance, not partnership. The BRICS plus dimension represents the second major link in the chain reaction. The bombing validates everything BRICS plus nations have been saying about the need for multipolarity and alternatives to American hegemony. It provides perfect justification for institutional development that was proceeding slowly due to coordination challenges and divergent national interests. China will accelerate BRICS plus institutional development and financing specifically to demonstrate that alternatives to American-dominated systems can function. The new development bank will announce major expansions of lending capacity. The BRICS plus payment system development, an alternative to SWIFT that's been discussed for years but has moved slowly, will accelerate dramatically with Chinese technical support and financing. The BRICS plus expansion that brought in Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, and Egypt will now proceed to the next wave. Countries that were cautiously considering membership now have clear demonstration of why it's necessary. Expect applications from Turkey, Indonesia, Malaysia, and potentially Mexico within the next year. Each addition makes the bloc more economically significant and better able to provide alternatives to Western institutions. The coordination challenges that have limited BRICS Plus effectiveness will diminish as the shared interest in resisting American pressure becomes more salient. China, Russia, India, and Brazil have significant strategic differences and competing interests, but the bombing creates a common cause, preventing American military enforcement of economic preferences that can overcome differences on other issues. This doesn't mean BRICS Plus becomes a formal alliance, but it does mean coordination improves on specific issues where American pressure affects members. Russia will position itself as the security partner for countries facing American military threats. Russian private military contractors, weapons sales, and training programs will expand specifically in Latin America and Middle East. Russia benefits from any fragmentation of American influence and will invest resources in supporting countries that American pressure is pushing away from Western alignment. Venezuela will receive increased Russian military support specifically as demonstration that Russian partnership provides security against American action. India's position is most complicated because India maintains strategic partnerships with the United States while also participating in BRICS Plus and pursuing non-dollar trade. The bombing forces India toward harder choices. Indian dependence on Russian oil and arms means India can't align fully with American sanctions regimes. Indian economic interests in multipolarity conflict with security interests in American partnership against China. The bombing shifts the balance by demonstrating that American power is about dominance rather than partnership, making Indian hedging more pronounced. Saudi Arabia's response may be the most consequential for dollar dominance. Saudi Arabia is the petrodollar system's foundation. If Saudi Arabia accelerates diversification away from exclusive dollar oil pricing, the system's erosion becomes irreversible. The bombing puts Saudi Arabia in difficult position. The kingdom wants American security guarantees but also wants economic relationships with China that require some yuan commerce. Expect Saudi Arabia to make symbolic gestures of support for American position on Venezuela, while quietly accelerating yuan trade with China. Saudi announcements of expanded Chinese investment in Saudi infrastructure, Saudi participation in yuan clearing systems, and Saudi oil sales to China with yuan settlement options will all increase specifically because the bombing demonstrated that dollar dependency creates political vulnerability. The Saudis won't abandon the dollar suddenly, but they'll hedge harder, and that hedging accelerates petrodollar erosion. UAE will move faster than Saudi Arabia because UAE faces fewer security dependencies on the United States and has positioned itself as a financial bridge between East and West. Dubai and Abu Dhabi will expand yuan clearing facilities, Chinese bank presence, and yuan-denominated financial products specifically to capture the business that comes from countries diversifying away from dollar systems. This makes UAE the Gulf's yuan hub and accelerates regional de-dollarization. Iran gains validation for its complete break from dollar systems. Iranian messaging to other countries facing American pressure will be, "We proved you can survive complete dollar exclusion through yuan trade and BRICS Plus partnership." The bombing demonstrates that even partial dollar dependency brings military risk, so complete diversification is actually safer. Countries considering whether to resist American pressure now have Iranian examples showing that survival is possible. The middle power chain reaction extends beyond BRICS Plus members to countries globally that are calculating acceptable levels of dependence on American-dominated systems. Turkey has been pursuing independent policies despite NATO membership and facing American pressure on issues from Syria to S-400 missile purchases. The bombing demonstrates that American pressure can escalate to military force, but also that countries can resist if they develop alternatives. Turkey will accelerate non-dollar trade, particularly with Russia, Iran, and China. Turkish participation in yuan clearing systems, Turkish infrastructure financing from Chinese banks, and Turkish defense cooperation with Russia will all increase specifically as hedging against American pressure. Turkey won't leave NATO, but Turkish independence within NATO will increase, and Turkish economic orientation will shift further toward Eurasia. Indonesia faces similar calculations. Indonesia is Southeast Asia's largest economy, and a democracy that values non-alignment. Indonesian concern about Chinese influence in the South China Sea creates incentives for American partnership, but Indonesian nationalism opposes any form of dependency. The bombing demonstrates that American partnership comes with demands backed by military force. Indonesian hedging will accelerate. More yuan trade, more Chinese infrastructure investment, more participation in regional institutions that exclude American dominance. Malaysia, under its current government, is already pursuing closer China ties while maintaining Western economic relationships. The bombing provides justification for accelerating this hedging. Malaysian yuan trade, Malaysian participation in Chinese payment systems, and Malaysian infrastructure financed by Chinese banks will all increase. Southeast Asian integration through ASEAN will emphasize autonomy from both American and Chinese dominance, but the practical effect will be reducing American economic leverage. The most significant chain reaction may be in Africa, where Chinese infrastructure investment has already created dependencies that shift political alignments. The bombing demonstrates to African nations that American power is about dominance rather than partnership, and that countries aligning with China face potential American military pressure. But it also demonstrates that Chinese partnership provides alternatives that make American pressure survivable. Expect acceleration of African participation in WAN trade systems, Chinese infrastructure financing, and BRICS Plus institutional engagement. Countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa will expand Chinese banking relationships specifically because the bombing demonstrated the risks of dollar dependency. Nigeria specifically will accelerate Chinese engagement despite traditional Western orientation. Nigerian oil exports create dollar dependency that the bombing demonstrates is a vulnerability. Chinese purchases of Nigerian oil in WAN, Chinese financing for Nigerian infrastructure including the Lagos-Kano Railway and port development, and Chinese investment in Nigerian manufacturing will all increase. Nigeria's position as Africa's largest economy makes this shift regionally significant. Kenya's existing Chinese infrastructure, the standard gauge railway connecting Nairobi to Mombasa, created debt dependencies that Western institutions criticized. The bombing validates Kenyan decision to pursue Chinese financing despite criticism. Expect expanded Chinese financing for Kenyan infrastructure, specifically for ports, energy, and transportation. Kenya will position itself as East Africa's hub for Chinese commerce, similar to UAE's role in the Gulf. Ethiopia's relationship with China through infrastructure financing and industrial parks will deepen. Ethiopian debt restructuring negotiations will increasingly favor Chinese bilateral terms over IMF multilateral conditions. Ethiopia's strategic position controlling Nile headwaters gives it leverage that the bombing demonstrates should be used to maximize Chinese support against Western pressure. The African Continental Free Trade Area will increasingly integrate with Chinese rather than American economic systems. The technology dimension of the chain reaction operates through Chinese digital infrastructure expansion. Countries diversifying away from dollar systems need alternative payment infrastructure. China provides that through Alipay, WeChat Pay, digital yuan development, and banking technology. The bombing accelerates adoption of Chinese payment systems in Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and Southeast Asia, specifically because these systems enable commerce that bypasses American financial oversight and sanctions capabilities. Once countries integrate Chinese digital payment infrastructure, the switching costs to return to dollar-based systems become enormous. The infrastructure integration creates path dependency, where non-dollar trade becomes easier over time as more countries join the network. This is exactly how dollar dominance was built, through infrastructure and network effects. The bombing accelerates the construction of alternative infrastructure that could eventually rival dollar systems. The commodity pricing chain reaction extends beyond oil to other critical resources. If oil can trade in yuan through Shanghai futures markets, why not copper, aluminum, lithium, rare earths, and agricultural commodities? The bombing demonstrates that dollar-denominated commodity pricing creates vulnerability to American political decisions. Commodity exporters will accelerate development of yuan-denominated pricing mechanisms for strategic resources. China has been developing yuan commodity futures markets for years but faced limited international participation. The bombing changes the calculation for commodity exporters. Trading in yuan reduces exposure to dollar volatility and American political risk. As more commodities trade in yuan, the liquidity in yuan markets increases, making yuan commerce more attractive, creating self-reinforcing dynamics that erode dollar commodity pricing dominance. The debt dimension creates another chain reaction through sovereign debt restructuring. Many developing countries face unsustainable dollar-denominated debts to Western creditors. Traditional restructuring requires IMF involvement with conditions that impose austerity and privatization. China offers alternative restructuring through bilateral negotiations, yuan-denominated replacement debt, and infrastructure for debt swaps. The bombing accelerates developing country willingness to consider Chinese debt restructuring alternatives. Countries facing debt crises now have demonstration that Western systems come with political conditions backed by military force. Chinese alternatives may come with their own conditions, but they don't include bombing. The practical effect is shifting debt dependencies from Western creditors to Chinese creditors, which shifts political alignments. The military dimension creates a chain reaction through arms, sales, and security partnerships. Countries facing American pressure need alternatives to American weapon systems and security cooperation. Russia and China both benefit from providing those alternatives. Russian arms sales to Latin America, Middle East, and Africa will increase specifically because the bombing demonstrated that American security partnerships come with demands backed by military force. China's more limited but growing arms export capacity will also expand, particularly for drones, missiles, and defensive systems. Chinese security cooperation agreements, training, intelligence sharing, military exercises will increase with countries that American bombing has pushed toward seeking alternatives. This doesn't create formal alliances, but it does create security relationships that reduce American leverage. The refugee chain reaction amplifies existing pressures. Venezuela already produced over 7 million refugees, destabilizing Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, and other neighbors. The bombing will likely increase refugee flows as Venezuelans flee potential escalation. This creates political pressure on receiving countries that strengthens anti-American sentiment and makes those countries more willing to resist American demands. The receiving countries face impossible situations. They need international support to handle refugee costs. Traditional support comes through American-dominated institutions with political conditions. Chinese support comes without conditions, but creates economic dependencies. The bombing makes Chinese support more attractive by demonstrating that Western support systems come with political demands backed by military force. The international law chain reaction undermines American claims to rules-based order. American rhetoric emphasizes international law, sovereignty, and rules-based systems. The bombing contradicts all of that without UN Security Council authorization, without imminent threat justification, and without meaningful international support. Countries that took American rules-based rhetoric seriously now have clear demonstration that American power operates outside claimed rules. This validates Chinese and Russian arguments that Western rules-based order is actually Western dominance disguised as universal principles. Every country that valued international law now has to decide whether to condemn American violation or remain silent, and implicitly accept that power determines rules. Most will choose silence publicly, while adjusting policies privately to reflect the reality that American power operates outside international law constraints. The climate dimension creates an underappreciated chain reaction. Climate adaptation requires enormous infrastructure investment that developing countries can't finance through traditional Western institutions at necessary scales. Chinese infrastructure financing specifically for climate adaptation, renewable energy, water systems, coastal defenses, becomes more attractive when Western alternatives come with political conditions. The bombing accelerates developing country acceptance of Chinese climate financing, specifically because it demonstrates that Western institutions attach political conditions that can extend to military force. Countries facing existential climate threats can't afford to reject financing because of dependency concerns. Chinese financing becomes the only viable option, creating dependencies that shift political alignments regardless of long-term concerns. The demonstration effect chain reaction may be most significant long-term. Every country watching the Venezuela bombing and its aftermath draws lessons about acceptable behavior, effective strategies, and likely consequences. The intended lesson, don't challenge American interests, competes with alternative lessons that may prove more influential. Countries see that American bombing strengthened Maduro rather than weakening him. They see that regional condemnation was unanimous and American isolation increased. They see that China and Russia provided immediate support that enabled Venezuela to resist American pressure. They see that American military action triggered exactly the multipolar coordination that American policy claims to prevent. These lessons suggest that resisting American pressure is viable if countries develop alternatives and coordinate with other resistant states. The time horizon chain reaction operates because infrastructure investments and institutional developments have long-lasting effects. A country that builds yuan payment infrastructure today won't reverse that investment if political tensions ease tomorrow. A country that restructures dollar debt into yuan debt has locked in that relationship for decades. A country that integrates Chinese digital payment systems has created switching costs that persist regardless of leadership changes. The bombing triggered immediate responses that will have permanent effects. The infrastructure being built, the institutions being developed, the relationships being formalized, these will outlast the specific political tensions that motivated them. In 10 years, the global economic architecture will reflect decisions made in response to the Venezuela bombing even if everyone has forgotten the bombing itself. The feedback loop chain reaction means each step accelerates the next. Mexico accepting yuan creates demand for yuan liquidity in Latin America. That liquidity makes yuan trade easier for other countries. More yuan trade creates more infrastructure. More infrastructure makes further yuan adoption easier. The dynamics are self-reinforcing once triggered. The bombing provided the trigger. The chain reaction will continue regardless of whether additional American military action occurs. The ultimate chain reaction is the transformation from American unipolarity to genuine multipolarity. The bombing was intended to defend American dominance. The chain reaction it triggered will accelerate American dominance erosion by demonstrating that American power creates the security threats that make multipolarity necessary, by providing opportunities for alternative institution building, and by shifting momentum toward multipolar coordination. What happens after Venezuela matters more than the bombing itself. And what happens is the acceleration of exactly the multipolar transformation that American policy seeks to prevent.